Have you ever wondered what happens when a rookie with an MBA bought by his father unplugs a $30 million machine I held the keys to our digital fortress? Yet a petty boss fired me just to flex his power. Their fatal mistake was believing servers run themselves. Getting fired was not the end. The real game began when those glass doors closed and the countdown to destruction started. Are you ready to watch a corporate empire falls? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero operating budget to keep bringing you these tales of corporate justice. If you find today's story engaging and want to support us, please consider joining our Patreon community, where we share even better, exclusive true stories. Those Patreon episodes are much longer, feature detailed situations we simply cannot make public on YouTube, and include multiple emotional voice actors to bring the drama to vivid life. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, as told by our protagonist, Madeline Martinez. The air inside OmniStream Dynamics always tasted like ozone and filtered frost, nestled high in the snow-choked mountains of Denver, Colorado. Our data center was not just a building, it was a living, breathing beast of silicon and steel working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I am 34 years old, and my official title was Data Automation Architect. But in reality, I was the cold keeper of the flame, or rather, the one who kept the flame from consuming us all. For 10 grueling years, I had poured my absolute soul into designing Glacier Sync, a proprietary physical heat and data load balancing protocol. It was the single thread standing between our $30 million server farm and a catastrophic meltdown. The servers ran so incredibly hot they could melt through their own structural racks within minutes, and my liquid cooling system was the ice in their veins. There is a profound, heavy silence in a server room, hidden just beneath the deafening roar of industrial-grade ventilation fans. It is a world of pure, unadulterated logic, where data flows like cold blood and every single variable is accounted for. I vastly preferred the company of these towering black cabinets to the people in the brightly lit executive suites. I did not care for management politics or corporate synergy. I cared about temperature equilibrium, about absolute zero latency rates, and about the unforgiving, immovable laws of thermodynamics. While the executives downstairs popped expensive champagne over their 99% profit projections, I walked the frozen aisles, listening to the hum of the processors, feeling the very heartbeat of the internet beneath my fingertips. It was an elegant, perfectly balanced ecosystem. Then, Julian Vance arrived and shattered the quiet. Julian was the golden child of our founding chief executive officer, Marcus Vance. Julian had spent the last 5 years bouncing between failed cryptocurrency startups and luxury wellness retreats across the globe, burning through his massive trust fund with the kind of reckless abandon only the ultra-rich can afford. When his last digital coin venture completely collapsed, his father decided it was time to bring the prodigal son home to roost. Marcus installed Julian as the newly minted Director of Technological Innovation. Julian showed up on his very first day wearing a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than a junior engineer's annual salary. Smelling of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance, his ego took up more space than our largest mainframe network. He was a man who spoke entirely in hollow buzzwords. He knew absolutely nothing about the heavy physical reality of data. To Julian, the cloud was just a magical, ethereal place where information floated freely, completely divorced from the massive, heat-generating hardware that actually sustained it. He immediately set out to mark his territory, and his absolute favorite way to exert power was by publicly humiliating the core technical staff. He would parade through the server aisles with a small entourage of sycophants, pointing at my meticulously crafted liquid cooling pipes and sneering in disgust. "This entire setup is an absolute dinosaur," Julian announced during his first departmental meeting. leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his perfectly manicured fingers. We are bleeding capital maintaining these massive physical footprint protocols. It is completely obsolete. I want everything transitioned to a low-cost, fully virtualized cloud infrastructure by the end of the fiscal year. We need to be lean, agile, and disruptive. He looked directly at me when he said the word obsolete. He desperately wanted a reaction. He wanted me to defend my 10 years of grueling work, to beg for the relevance of my life's masterpiece. He simply did not understand that you cannot disrupt physics. A virtual server still lives on a physical rack, and that physical rack still generates enough heat to start a localized inferno if not properly cooled. But arguing with a man who bought his Master of Business Administration degree with his father's checkbook was like trying to explain advanced calculus to a wall. So, I stayed completely silent. I did not blink. I just watched him with the same detached observation I used when monitoring a failing hard drive cluster. My deadpan silence unnerved him, though he tried his hardest not to show it. Every single morning, exactly at 6 o'clock, I continued my sacred routine, long before Julian or anyone else in the executive suite had even woken up in their warm beds. I walked the entire length of the main server floor. I manually checked the biometric sensor valves on the primary coolant lines. It was a redundant safety process, one that required my specific fingerprint and retinal scan to authorize the physical flow of the sub-zero liquid if the automated systems ever blipped. It was a brilliant failsafe that I had hard-coded into the architecture, a secret physical tether between the machine and its creator. Only I understood the true, terrifying importance of those valves. Julian saw them as ancient plumbing. I knew they were the only things keeping his shiny new kingdom from turning into a pile of molten slag. He thought he ruled the digital realm, but he completely forgot who controlled the physical world it depended on. The corporate energy restructuring began on a gloomy Tuesday morning. That was the hollow phrase Julian used to mask his ruthless purge of our veteran engineering staff. One by one, the foundational pillars of OmniStream Dynamics were escorted out of the building by security. Men and women who had spent over a decade building our digital infrastructure from the ground up were suddenly deemed redundant. In their place, Julian brought in a swarm of his former fraternity brothers and failed startup partners. They roamed the sterile hallways in expensive sneakers and designer hoodies, loudly discussing decentralized web integrations, while spilling artisanal coffee near highly sensitive routing nodes. They knew nothing about the crushing physical pressure of data management. To them, technology was just a playground. To me, it was a finely tuned engine that could detonate if mishandled. I kept my head down and focused entirely on the server diagnostics. My survival strategy had always been invisibility, but the digital realm leaves a trail, and no one knew the pathways of our network better than I did. The revelation came exactly at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. I was sitting alone in the dark glow of my control terminal, conducting a routine sweep of the deep sector storage arrays. Most people think data theft happens with a dramatic hack from an external enemy, but the deadliest breaches always come from inside the house. A sudden, massive spike in outgoing bandwidth caught my eye. Someone was siphoning an enormous amount of encrypted data through a heavily obfuscated subnetwork. It was a clumsy, brute force extraction masquerading as a routine system backup. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, tracing the digital footprints backward through the security firewalls. I bypassed the false internet protocol addresses in a matter of seconds. The data stream led directly to the executive suite. It was pinging from Julian Vance's private terminal. I watched the progress bar on my monitor, my breath catching in my throat. He was not just downloading financial reports or client lists. He was systematically copying the entire core source code of Glacier Sync to an encrypted personal hard drive. Every single thermal balancing algorithm, every physical feedback loop, every localized cooling command I had meticulously written over the past 10 years was being swallowed up by his external device. The motive hit me with absolute clarity. Julian was preparing to sell my life's work to a rival tech conglomerate. He would repackage my decade of agonizing labor as his own brilliant personal invention. He planned to secure a massive golden parachute before his father ever realized the company was being gutted from the inside out. A lesser person might have stormed into his office, screaming and demanding justice. A lesser person might have immediately called the legal department or his father. But corporate legal battles are messy, drawn-out affairs where the rich son always wins, and the disgruntled employee is buried in endless litigation. I did not get angry. I did not shed a single tear. I simply went to work. If Julian wanted the keys to the kingdom, I was going to give them to him, but I was going to make sure the crown was poisoned. I opened the Central Administrative Command Terminal, bypassing the standard graphical interfaces to dive straight into the raw, uncompiled machine code of the physical safety protocols. I began quietly constructing what engineers call a dead man's switch. It is a fail-safe mechanism designed to activate autonomously if the human operator becomes incapacitated. For years, the cooling system was designed to send out warning alarms if my daily biometric scan was missed. I completely rewrote that specific algorithm. Now, if the system did not receive my exact retinal scan and fingerprint authentication within 24 hours, it would no longer issue a polite warning. Instead, it would assume a critical biological hazard had occurred and instantly initiate a protocol I called deep freeze. The system would manually shut down the liquid cooling pumps to prevent a catastrophic pressure explosion, but to contain the resulting thermal spike, it would drop the heavy titanium blast doors across the entire server farm. It would physically quarantine the $30 million infrastructure, severing all external network connections to protect the data integrity. It would become an impenetrable, completely sealed steel tomb. But I was not finished. The switch was just the physical trap. I needed a digital executioner. I split my screen and accessed the live directory that Julian was currently downloading. He was so incredibly arrogant that he had left the transfer port wide open. I slipped into his outgoing data stream like a shadow. I quickly wrote a highly aggressive counter-espionage payload and embedded it deep within the thermal regulation code he was stealing. It was a digital ghost. As long as the code remained on his personal hard drive or our internal servers, the ghost would sleep peacefully. It would look exactly like a standard operating file. However, the absolute second that stolen code was executed in an external, foreign environment, the ghost would violently wake up. It would not balance any servers. It would not cool any processors. Instead, it would hijack the host network and detonate a broadcast command, spewing every single piece of its own tracking history across whatever screens it could find. I sat back and watched the final percentage of his download complete. Julian safely disconnected his hard drive, completely oblivious to the fact that he was now carrying a live digital grenade in his expensive leather briefcase. He thought he had stolen my empire. He did not realize I had just handed him the rope for his own execution. The trap was set, completely invisible and perfectly lethal. All I had to do now was wait for him to pull the trigger. Late Friday afternoon, the harsh fluorescent lights of the Human Resources Department felt completely different from the comforting, dim blue glow of the server aisles. I received the urgent summons exactly at 4 o'clock. The glass-walled conference room stood at the end of the executive corridor like a transparent execution chamber. Everyone walking past could see directly inside, which was precisely the point. It was deliberately designed for maximum public humiliation. I pushed open the heavy, soundproof glass door and stepped into the sterile room. The air conditioning was cranked up uncomfortably high, but it severely lacked the pure, ozone-filtered crispness of my data center. Sitting dead center at the head of the expansive, polished mahogany table was Julian Vance. He was casually leaning back in an ergonomic mesh chair, effortlessly spinning a solid gold fountain pen between his manicured fingers. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that barely fit within the confines of his tailored collar. Next to him sat a human resources representative whose name I did not even bother to try and remember. She looked incredibly nervous, tightly gripping a thick manila folder that contained my entire professional history. Julian did not offer me a seat. He simply stopped spinning the pen, letting it drop onto the table with a sharp, echoing clack that cut through the heavy silence of the room. He looked me up and down with an expression of sheer, unadulterated smugness. He looked like a predator playing with what he completely believed was a defenseless, cornered animal. "Madeline," Julian began, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, synthetic sympathy. "We are moving OmniStream Dynamics into a highly agile, extremely dynamic future after a highly thorough review of our operational matrix. We have firmly determined that your specific role no longer holds any core value to our modern enterprise." He paused dramatically, clearly waiting for the shock and devastation to register on my face. He wanted tears. He wanted panic, when I offered him absolutely nothing but a deadpan, unblinking stare. His smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before widening even further. "Let us be completely honest here," he continued, leaning his body forward and resting his elbows heavily on the table. "We have very recently acquired and seamlessly integrated a fully automated, state-of-the-art technological framework. It is entirely self-sustaining. The outdated days of needing a highly paid tech plumber to manually monitor liquid cooling pipes are officially over. The infrastructure practically runs itself now." A tech plumber, that was what he called 10 years of architectural mastery. He was, of course, referring to the very source code he had stolen from my terminal just 2 nights prior. He truly believed he had seamlessly imported my entire decade of grueling, highly specialized expertise into a neat little executable file that would suddenly make my physical presence entirely obsolete. He did not understand the immense, terrifying kinetic energy that $30 million of enterprise hardware generated. He thought data was completely weightless. The human resources representative nervously cleared her throat and slid a standard severance agreement across the polished wood toward me. She started muttering something rapidly about a strict non-disclosure clause and an insulting 2 weeks of standard base compensation, but I completely tuned her out. I did not raise my voice in protest. I did not demand a better severance package. I did not mention his late-night digital theft or loudly threaten to call his father. I simply reached up to the back of my neck and unclipped my heavy security lanyard. The thick plastic identification badge, adorned with the highest-level biometric clearance codes in the entire facility, felt strangely light in my palm. I placed it very gently onto the exact center of the table. The plastic made a soft, final click against the wood. I leaned down just slightly, meeting Julian's arrogant gaze with eyes as cold as the liquid nitrogen currently flowing through my coolant pipes. "Are you absolutely sure you know how to cool a reactor core?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. It was a genuine question, delivered with the absolute, chilling certainty of someone who already knew the catastrophic future. Julian let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He slapped the table, genuinely thinking I was making a desperate, pathetic, metaphorical plea to save my job. "Security!" he called out loudly, waving his hand dismissively toward the glass door without breaking eye contact with me. 2 large men wearing dark tactical uniforms instantly stepped into the room. "Please escort our former employee off the premises immediately. Make absolutely sure she does not touch a single keyboard on her way out." The 2 guards quickly flanked me, treating me exactly like a highly dangerous corporate spy caught in the act of sabotage. I walked calmly between them, my head held high, my measured footsteps echoing rhythmically down the long, empty corridors. I did not look at the confused faces of the junior developers pressing their faces against the glass partitions to watch me leave. When the main glass doors finally slid open, the biting, violent chill of the Denver blizzard instantly hit my face. The snow was falling heavily, painting the entire rugged mountain landscape in a blinding, unforgiving white. Before stepping down into the freezing, snow-covered parking lot, I turned around and looked back through the frosted glass of the lobby. Deep within the concrete structure, I could faintly hear the steady, rhythmic, industrial beeping of the massive server farm. It was the mechanical heartbeat of my $30 million machine, beating steadily for now. I pulled back the sleeve of my heavy winter coat and checked my mechanical wristwatch. It was exactly 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday. The invisible, 24-hour biometric countdown had officially begun ticking. I zipped my coat, pulled up my collar, and walked away into the storm, knowing with absolute certainty that by this time tomorrow, Julian Vance's stolen digital empire would face the brutal, unstoppable wrath of physics. Saturday afternoon arrived with the quiet, serene beauty that only a Colorado winter could bring. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the warm, cedar-scented kitchen of my secluded mountain cabin. I carefully measured out fresh, dark roast coffee beans, letting the rhythmic, grinding hum of the machine fill the peaceful silence. I poured boiling water over the grounds, watching the rich, dark liquid bloom. Down in the valley, exactly 24 hours had passed since I placed my badge on that polished mahogany table. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my ceramic mug. The coffee was perfectly bitter. Miles away, deep inside the concrete belly of OmniStream Dynamics, the primary biological security timer reached zero. The system actively pinged the main terminal, desperately searching for my retinal scan and fingerprint. It found absolutely nothing. Following its newly rewritten core directives, the physical valves governing the flow of the sub-zero liquid coolant quietly began to constrict. The massive, roaring processors continued to ingest and route millions of gigabytes of global traffic, generating tremendous amounts of kinetic heat. Without the steady flow of the icy liquid, the ambient temperature inside the enclosed server racks began to climb rapidly. However, up in the main control room, Julian Vance and his hand-picked team of amateur engineers suspected absolutely nothing. They were casually leaning back in their expensive ergonomic chairs, tossing a small foam football back and forth. The massive digital monitoring screens mounted on the wall painted a picture of absolute perfection. Thanks to the highly sophisticated decoy code I had left behind, every single thermal indicator glowed a reassuring, artificial green. The monitors proudly displayed a stable ambient temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a digital mirage, blinding them to the catastrophic reality building just on the other side of the wall. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the physical temperature inside the server containment zone surpassed 190 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy plastic casing around the auxiliary cables began to warp and blister, filling the sealed room with the acrid, toxic stench of melting synthetic polymers. The hardware was screaming, pushing itself toward a localized physical meltdown. The primary safety threshold was officially breached. The deep freeze protocol engaged without a single warning siren. It happened with terrifying, mechanical violence. Massive, foot-thick titanium blast doors, designed to contain a massive electrical fire, simultaneously dropped from the ceiling on all four sides of the server farm. They slammed into the reinforced concrete floor with a deafening, earth-shaking crash that reverberated through the entire facility. Heavy steel deadbolts automatically and violently shot into place, physically quarantining the $30 million infrastructure. Simultaneously, the protocol executed its secondary directive: to protect the compromised data from external corruption during a perceived critical thermal event. The system ruthlessly severed all external fiber optic connections. Massive physical relays clacked open, cutting the hard lines. In a fraction of a second, millions of gigabytes of vital client data were completely locked inside an impenetrable steel fortress. OmniStream Dynamics simply ceased to exist on the global internet. I sat by my stone fireplace, watching the orange flames dance over the dry birch logs. The absolute silence of my cabin was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was currently unfolding. I gently stroked the soft fur of my orange tabby cat, who was purring loudly on my lap. He wore a brand new, slightly bulky collar around his neck. I smiled, taking another warm sip of my coffee. Total panic erupted inside the data center. The sudden violent lockdown sent the frat boy engineers scrambling. Their fake green monitors instantly flickered and died, replaced by blaring red emergency strobes. They frantically slammed their hands against the control keyboards. completely failing to comprehend how a system that was perfectly stable 3 seconds ago had suddenly transformed into a maximum security vault. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, Julian Vance was violently pulled from his sleep by his ringing phone. He arrived at the facility 20 minutes later, sprinting through the glass lobby with his designer coat unbuttoned and his hair completely disheveled. The arrogant, slick executive from Friday afternoon was completely gone, replaced by a terrified man staring into the abyss of his own making. He pushed past his panicked team and threw himself into the primary administrative terminal. His fingers clumsily pounded the keys, desperately trying to inject the stolen source code he believed was the ultimate master key. He ran the executable file, sweating profusely in the freezing air conditioning of the control room. The system ruthlessly rejected him. Every single override command, every desperate hack, every backdoor access attempt violently bounced back. The large overhead monitors flashed a single, bright red text prompt that reflected in Julian's horrified eyes. Protection protocol error. Supreme Administrator authentication required. He screamed in sheer frustration, slamming his fists into the expensive mechanical keyboard until the plastic keys shattered. He demanded his engineers manually pry the blast doors open, completely ignoring the fact that those doors were designed to withstand a direct blast from military-grade explosives. They were trapped on the outside, and the data was held hostage on the inside. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the corporate fallout began. The external communication lines that were not physically severed began to ring incessantly. Major corporate clients, massive online retailers, and international banking institutions were waking up to find their entire cloud infrastructures completely vanished. The angry emails began flooding the executive inboxes, rapidly escalating from confused inquiries to aggressive demands. Then came the official legal notices. Powerful law firms representing Fortune 500 companies began firing off immediate threats of multi-million-dollar lawsuits for catastrophic breach of contract and severe operational damages. The company was paralyzed. The digital arteries were severed. Julian stood in the center of the flashing red control room, his breathing shallow and erratic. His grand vision of a fully automated, extremely cheap virtual cloud had just violently collided with the cold, unforgiving reality of physical hardware. He had proudly fired the only person who knew how to speak the language of the machine, and now, the machine was punishing him with absolute, deafening silence. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the situation inside the facility had escalated from a critical emergency to a full-blown corporate apocalypse. The boardroom, a massive glass enclosure suspended directly above the main server floor, was packed with panicked executives. The air conditioning was completely failing, and the heat radiating from the sealed server vault below was beginning to seep through the floorboards. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and raw, unfiltered fear. Julian was entirely out of his depth, his bespoke Italian suit now violently wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He paced frantically at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, in a state of sheer, unadulterated desperation. He pulled out his phone and made a highly encrypted call to his shady prospective buyers. He truly believed that the rival tech conglomerate, the very people he was planning to sell my life's work to, possessed the elite engineering firepower required to crack the lockdown. He paced the room, wildly promising them immediate, unrestricted access to the revolutionary source code if their off-the-books hackers could just help him bypass the administrative wall. He desperately needed to prove his technical competence before his ultimate nightmare walked through the door. That nightmare arrived exactly at 7 o'clock. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently swung open, and Marcus Vance, the founding chief executive officer, stormed into the room. He had taken his private jet directly from a global technology summit in Tokyo. Flying frantically through the night the absolute second the catastrophic failure alerts hit his phone. Marcus was a terrifying figure, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire from scratch with his bare hands. And right now, he looked ready to execute someone on the very spot he stood. "What in God's name have you done to my company?" Marcus bellowed, his booming voice echoing dangerously off the glass walls. "We are hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single minute. The entire data center is completely sealed off from the outside world. Major international banks are threatening to destroy us. Give me an answer. Julian." Julian visibly shrank under his father's furious, uncompromising gaze. He scrambled over to his private laptop, his hands shaking so violently he could barely connect the auxiliary cable to the main projection system of the boardroom. He forced a sickeningly confident smile onto his face, desperately attempting to project the hollow illusion of control. "It is just a minor synchronization glitch with the old, completely obsolete cooling firmware." Julian lied smoothly, though his voice cracked noticeably on the final word. "I am deploying the new, fully automated protocol right now. It is my own personal design. It will seamlessly override the lockdown and restore 100% operational capacity immediately. Watch." Marcus crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed into dangerous, unforgiving slits. "Do it, now." Julian hovered his trembling finger over the return key. He was about to execute the stolen core file of Glacier Sync, completely unaware that he was stepping directly onto the digital landmine I had so carefully planted 2 nights prior. He pressed the key. For exactly 2 agonizing seconds, the massive overhead screens in the boardroom went completely black. Julian let out a loud, highly exaggerated sigh of relief, genuinely thinking the system was finally rebooting and his nightmare was over. Then, my digital ghost woke up. It did not interface with the cooling valves. It did not send a single line of stabilizing code to the locked blast doors. It completely ignored the thermal sensors. Instead, the payload violently hijacked the internal audio and visual network of the entire executive suite. The massive, high-definition screens suddenly flared to life with a blinding intensity, casting a harsh, pale light across the terrified faces of the assembled board members. A black command prompt appeared in massive, bold letters, rapidly scrolling through lines of raw execution data. Then, the broadcast began. The very first thing to appear on the central screen was a crystal-clear video capture of Julian's own desktop from Thursday at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The entire room watched in dead, horrified silence as the cursor moved purposefully across the screen, systematically copying the highly classified Glacier Sync proprietary architecture into a hidden, encrypted folder labeled Personal Export, the exact timestamp, along with his unique network protocol address, flashed in massive, pulsing red font at the bottom of the screen, undeniably and permanently proving his identity. Julian let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His face instantly draining of all color, he frantically lunged forward across the table, desperately trying to rip the connection cable out of his laptop, but the ghost was already completely integrated into the boardroom's isolated mainframe. Ripping the physical cord out did absolutely nothing to stop the flow of information. The screen rapidly shifted, pulling up a series of highly incriminating, deeply encrypted emails. The ghost had flawlessly decrypted them during its dormant phase, and now it was projecting Julian's secret negotiations for everyone in the room to read. They were direct messages sent to the chief technology officer of our absolute biggest market rival. "I have the complete thermal balancing algorithm." One email read in massive, undeniable text. "I can hand over 10 years of their research and development by the end of the week. My asking price is $5 million transferred immediately to an offshore holding account." Loud gasps erupted from the seated board members. The human resources representative who had fired me just days ago covered her mouth in absolute shock, her eyes wide with terror. Marcus Vance stood completely frozen, his face transforming into a terrifying mask of pure shock and devastating betrayal. He slowly turned his head to look at his son. He was no longer looking at an incompetent, arrogant fool who had accidentally crashed a $30 million machine. He was looking at a corporate traitor. He was looking at a criminal who had actively and maliciously attempted to completely dismantle his father's life work for a quick, illicit payout. "Father, I can explain." Julian stammered wildly. stepping backward until his spine hit the cold glass wall. It is a massive frame-up. That disgruntled engineer, Madeline, she planted this. She hacked my secure terminal. You fired her on Friday afternoon, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper that cut through the silence like a knife. The timestamp on this irrefutable theft is from Thursday morning. You stole the code, you fired the lead architect, and then you broke my facility. In a final act of pure, pathetic desperation, Julian turned back to the control terminal. He started screaming at the terrified engineers, violently demanding they run a brute force decryption protocol on the physical lockdown. He shouted until his throat was raw that there must be a back door, a hidden command line, some sort of highly advanced wireless override that could electronically force the titanium blast doors open. But that was the final, brutal twist of my entire design. Sitting comfortably by my warm fire, miles away from the corporate chaos, I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were frantically trying to pick a digital lock that did not actually exist in the digital world. The deep freeze protocol was the ultimate physical failsafe. It operated on a completely air-gapped, closed electrical loop. There was absolutely no remote access capability. There was no master password, no secret numerical code, and no wireless frequency signal that could ever tell those massive steel doors to rise. The only key in the entire world was a physical, microscopic radio frequency identification chip. It was a unique, highly encrypted piece of hardware that had to be physically pressed against a hidden scanner panel located right next to the main blast door. And that specific, irreplaceable microchip was currently sewn securely into the thick nylon fabric of the brand new, bright blue collar worn by my orange tabby cat. The very same cat I had casually carried out of the building in his travel carrier on Friday afternoon when Julian so smugly threw me out into the snow. They could type on those keyboards until their fingers literally bled. They could hire the greatest hackers on the planet, but until a fuzzy orange cat decided to take a stroll past the biometric scanner, that $30 million fortress was going to remain a giant, silent steel tomb. At exactly 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, the pristine silence of the snow-covered forest was broken by the heavy, struggling roar of a luxury sport utility vehicle. The massive black car plowed through the thick snowdrifts, finally coming to a halt at the edge of my remote property. Through the frosted window of my wooden cabin, I watched a figure step out into the freezing pre-dawn air. It was Marcus Vance, the great pioneer of the tech industry. A man who commanded boardrooms with an iron fist was now trudging through knee-deep snow, his expensive wool overcoat offering little protection against the biting alpine wind. He looked small, defeated, and entirely out of his element. He walked heavily up the wooden steps to my porch. He hesitated for a long moment, swallowing whatever remained of his immense corporate pride, before knocking firmly on the heavy oak door. I opened the door slowly. The freezing wind immediately rushed into the warm cabin, but I barely felt it. I stood comfortably in my thick knitted sweater, gently holding my large orange tabby cat against my chest. The cat purred softly, a low, rhythmic rumble that completely contrasted with the frantic, desperate energy radiating from the man standing on my welcome mat. "Madeline," Marcus said. His voice was hoarse, entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. His face was pale and drawn, revealing the deep, exhausting toll of a sleepless weekend spent watching his empire crumble. He reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of parchment. He held it out to me. "This is a completely blank contract," he continued, his tone practically begging. "You name your price. I am prepared to offer you an immediate salary increase of 5 times your previous rate, full executive benefits, total autonomy over the entire engineering department, and a permanent seat on the board of directors. Whatever you want, it is yours." I looked down at the piece of paper fluttering slightly in the wind, then back up to his desperate eyes. I did not reach out to take it. "And Julian?" I asked calmly, softly stroking the soft fur behind my cat's ears. Marcus's jaw tightened, a flash of pure anger crossing his exhausted features. "He is gone. I fired him the absolute second the board reviewed the evidence on those screens. He has been entirely stripped of his inheritance, and our corporate legal team is currently preparing to hand him over to federal authorities for massive intellectual property theft and corporate sabotage. He is facing multiple federal subpoenas by tomorrow morning. He will never set foot in my company, or any other technology firm, ever again. It was a comprehensive, absolute victory. The villain had been utterly destroyed by his own staggering arrogance, yet I felt no overwhelming surge of joy. I just felt a profound, quiet satisfaction, like watching the final piece of a complex puzzle slide perfectly into place. I looked at Marcus, offering a small, polite smile. I appreciate the update. Marcus, however, I am afraid you drove all the way up here for nothing. His eyes widened in sheer panic. Madeline, please, the entire system is completely locked down. We cannot crack the physical vault. The temperature is stable, but we are totally paralyzed. We need you to come back and unlock the doors. You misunderstand the architecture, I replied, my voice steady and measured. The deep freeze protocol was never designed to be a permanent tomb. That would be highly inefficient. It is an emergency stabilization measure. It is programmed to automatically thaw and completely release the titanium blast doors after exactly 72 hours. It does this to ensure the physical hardware is not permanently damaged by extended containment. Marcus let out a massive, shaky breath, closing his eyes as relief washed over his face. Thank God. 72 hours. We can survive that. Do not celebrate just yet, I interrupted softly, shattering his brief moment of hope. While the hardware will survive, the localized data cache holding the active transactions of your partners over the last 72 hours will be systematically purged upon reboot. It is a standard security flush to prevent corrupted data from re-entering the main network. That data will evaporate completely into thin air. Marcus stared at me, the blood draining from his face as the mathematical reality hit him. The hardware will be completely fine, I concluded, stepping back into the warmth of my cabin. But the lost cache data will cost your company tens of millions of dollars in immediate compensation payouts to your furious clients. Consider it the final, necessary price for your son's blind pursuit of technological innovation. I gently pushed the heavy oak door closed, shutting out his shocked protests. The heavy latch clicked into place, echoing with finality. I left the powerful chief executive officer standing frozen on my porch, completely alone in the biting winter cold. I walked back into my cozy living room, entirely at peace. I set the cat down on the soft rug in front of the roaring stone fireplace. I picked up my ceramic mug from the coffee table and took a slow, comforting sip of hot chocolate. The sweet warmth spread through my chest. I knelt down beside the cat and gently unbuckled the thick blue collar from his neck. I held the nylon fabric in my hand for a brief moment, feeling the small, hard lump of the hidden microchip inside, with a final, satisfied smile. I tossed the collar directly into the crackling fire. The flames quickly consumed the nylon and the silicon, turning the only key to the fortress into a puff of gray smoke. I leaned back into my armchair, ready to enjoy a perfectly quiet, uninterrupted Sunday. Thank you so very much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's tale of corporate justice satisfying and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our very best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the quick response code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Have a wonderful day.